It is just gone after 3 p.m. Central African time, coming to you all the way from Johannesburg. This is SA Today on SABC News. I'm Simpiwe Ngwane. Good afternoon. Now this story leads. President Cyril Ramaphosa has arrived in the Republic of Niger this morning to take part in the 12th summit of the African Union today. The summit will mark the launch of the agreement of the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area and will formally launch the operational phase of the African internal market. He is also expected to take part in the African Union Troika High-level meeting of the African Mechanism on Western Sahara. At the open session of the summit, Ramaphosa will, alongside President Paul Kagame of Rwanda, participate in the launch of the password-controlled tariff concession portal. Now, this portal will allow countries ready to extend tariff preferences and/or to give concessions to do so in a secure manner. Since its adoption, the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area, 52 countries have signed, with 24 ratifications, surpassing the threshold of 22 ratifications by the AU member states. The International Relations and Cooperation Minister Naledi Pandor, Finance Minister Tito Mboweni and Trade and Industry Minister Ibrahim Patel are accompanying the president. Well, among the other matters the summit will address is the looming security and migration crises on the continent. Nigeria, they have signed the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Last week, Nigeria said it would sign after unexpectedly pulling back from the agreement last year. The pact is further buoyed as Benin's agreement means that Eritrea is the sole African country not to sign on. The agreement comes after 17 years of tough negotiations and was formalized at the end of April when the agreement had crossed the launch threshold, which required ratification by at least 22 countries. Now, to discuss this further, we are joined now on the line by SABC's foreign editor, Sophie Mokoena. A very good afternoon to you, Sophie. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, talks on free trade began way back in 2002, culminating in a deal that in late May crossed the threshold of ratification by at least 22 countries. This is huge for Africa. Your thoughts there, Sophie?
Yes, this is huge for Africa at the time where the tension between US and China has created a platform for Africa to position itself as an alternative market. You know that here we're talking about a population of more than 1 billion. And secondly, we are told that the market amounts to 2.5 trillion US dollars. And we believe that many countries around the world will look to Africa in terms of investment, and they are already doing that. We saw the expansion of countries such as China and Russia into the continent, and we are also seeing America trying to resuscitate its strength on the continent, even though it's still military. It is hoped that they will also do that in terms of the economy or trade relations. This is huge, very, very big, and we are told that you know that Nigeria, one of the biggest markets on the continent, didn't sign. And we know that the reason was that Nigeria was going to elections and President Buhari was reluctant to sign because this could have cost him elections because there were concerns, particularly from the business community in Nigeria. Now Nigeria has signed, and Benin. This brings us to 54 countries that have signed except Eritrea, which is a small economy anyway. And secondly, in terms of enforcing this, the threshold was 22, but we have since surpassed 22. We are at 24. Therefore, today, the discussions will revolve around implementation. And here, South Africa, as the incoming chair of the African Union in 2020 January, will have to ensure that all agreements that will be signed today and issues that will be agreed upon in terms of implementation, all countries that have signed do implement.
Now, Sophie, by integrating those economies and reducing trade barriers such as tariffs, how will this free trade agreement influence employment prospects and living standards in Africa?
Well, we know that this will result in trade, boosting trade among countries. And therefore, if South Africa is doing business with African continent, we can send our products in Africa. And therefore, the issue of manufacturing comes into play. In other words, those manufacturing industries in South Africa will have to be strengthened. Beneficiation in terms of our minerals on the continent. We saw Rwanda launching a beneficiation plant in Kigali because they want to take an advantage of this African continental free trade area where they can have those processing plants in their countries. That's what every country must do in terms of its strength. And we can now say South Africa, having all these many minerals and industries, we can export goods to other countries on the continent.
Now, this has got huge historic implications, Sophie. It'll have a massive democratic shift. And some people say that it'll impact global markets. Just how much of an impact then will it have on the global markets?
It will, because now Africa becomes one market, contrary to a situation where every country was kind of doing business at the bilateral level. We're now coming as one big market. And as I indicated that this is an opportune time for us as Africa to rise and be counted among those areas where the leadership really does ensure that they build the economy of their own countries. Now, when you look at what's happening between China and America right now, the trade war, clearly there is instability. And therefore, countries will look to Africa to invest because you have these two big economies on the world at each other's throat. And Africa can utilize that tense atmosphere between the two countries to sell itself, and we can be an alternative market as a continent.
You know, Sophie, making it easier to trade goods through Africa for Africans will open the world further to the purchasing power of Africans and African countries. In as much as this may be a noble initiative, a noble and a plausible initiative, but do Africans really have the purchasing power to trade amongst themselves?
They do. I think we do. We tend to undermine ourselves. We do have a buying power. And I think us buying amongst ourselves rather than importing goods outside the continent, where we have to pay lots and lots of money in terms of the tariff, we can buy goods on the continent. You know, that will strengthen the economy on the continent, and many countries will benefit. But what we have to do is to ensure that Africans on the continent have the necessary skills to ensure that we become a manufacturing hub in the world. We shouldn't rely on other countries to export skills to South Africa. We must have our own skills. It is for that reason the challenge of the fourth industrial revolution is one area perhaps we really have to address so that we don't rely on the outside world for us to have those necessary skills for the fourth industrial revolution. Therefore, you need leadership, a visionary leadership. And I think Africans themselves shouldn't wait for governments to give them those necessary skills and capacity. We must do it. The institutions of higher learning on the continent must partner, and they must ensure that they are able to impart those necessary skills and training and knowledge to the young Africans on the continent.
I see, Sophie, you're quite vociferous in saying that, Africans do have the necessary gravitas to do things for themselves and amongst themselves. But, it has always been known that China is Africa's big brother. What does that mean for China's influence on the continent in terms of trade?
China has got the relations with Africa, the China-Africa pact, where the country and the continent engage on how this should be done. I think African leaders must be firm. Whatever agreement they sign, It must be an agreement that will translate in the development of the continent. In other words, trade must be on our own terms. Nothing about us without us. That should be the approach. It's well and good for China to come and invest here, but we must dictate the terms. We cannot allow the old way of doing things. You'd recall colonialism. That's what they did when they came to the continent. And we ended up being very, very poor. And them taking all our minerals on the continent. Therefore, at this day and age, particularly the young people of the continent, they must be very vigilant. They must follow the deliberations. They must always monitor the heads of state when they meet with any country or with any grouping on the world to ensure that whatever agreements are signed, it is to the benefit of the continent. And I have no doubt that the current crop of young people on the continent are well capacitated to be able to be vigilant and to tell the leaders on the continent what they want. Nothing about them without them.
And I suppose that the dismantling of trade barriers would most certainly facilitate that. Sophie, thank you so much for your time. That was SABC News foreign editor Sophie Mokoena speaking to us live on the line, just giving us a wrap of the African free trade area. And the latest is that Nigeria has signed this free trade area after holding off for a bit. Now,